What's good, everyone? My name is Jacob Moses, and welcome to another episode of the Not Boring Tech Writer, where in each episode we focus on a different skill that you can learn to enhance your skill set, improve your marketability, diversify your career, and ultimately break the stereotype that technical writing is a boring career. This episode's skill: researching as a tech writer. All of the help resources tech writers create, such as software documentation, video tutorials, or blog posts, require research. Imagine creating a document to explain a new feature before, say, even understanding how customers actually use the feature. Tech writers use several different resources to research the information they need, including conversations with developers and support, and reviewing support tickets. But if you're like many writers, we'll often seek too much information and face information overload, uncertain what to document. Or, as we'll learn from this episode's guest, we miss an opportunity to research the domain in which we work, a must for any tech writer, no matter their industry. That's why in this episode we have Margaret Eker on the podcast, tech writer at Magento, an Adobe company, and somewhat longtime friend since our days hiking in the forest of Portland, Oregon for Write the Docs 2016. Margaret prides herself as a researcher, and countless times has witnessed her work and relationships with her colleagues flourish when she dedicates herself to understanding the domain in which her company exists. In this episode, Margaret shares how you can boost your research skills as a tech writer, including how tech writers traditionally research new features, why tech writers should research the domain in which they work, and which steps you can take today to boost your research skills. Big shout out to Knowledge Owl, a wonderful knowledge-based software product, for sponsoring the Not Boring Tech Writer. And if you're looking for a tech writing gig or know someone looking for a tech writing gig, I got a cool opportunity for you. Do you know a tech writer who's passionate about customer service and would be interested in a role in San Francisco? If so, Red Balloons is offering a $2,000 referral bonus. All you need to do is go to redballoons.co/techwriter and refer someone or share your personalized link. Redballoons.co is a new recruiting platform that connects amazing people with great companies and rewards you for helping out. For more information, go to redballoons.co/techwriter. And happy Halloween! Hey there, Margaret. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Jacob, how's it going with you?
Things are going good. How's life in Austin?
It's really nice. We had a beautiful weekend. It's so nice it's not 100 degrees, and
Yes.
this is the best time of the year. Plus, it was Texas Book Festival. I didn't make it this year, but
Oh,
that
fun.
was a great week, great time to be in Austin.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear it. And Margaret, I was thinking back to, the last time you and I have spoken. Believe it or not, I think been like 3 years. I think we were walking in the trails of Portland, Oregon at
Yes,
Write the Docs 2016.
that's right. Yep.
Too long to not be
Yeah.
chatting.
Yeah.
What have you been
Well,
working on since then?
I've actually been doing different things. I was working. I've changed jobs a couple times, and I've now landed at started out at Magento, but now it's Adobe, and
Cool.
still doing technical writing. And I've gone from sort of the web hosting space at Rackspace, and then I was on
Yeah,
fleet management for a little while, and now I'm in e-commerce, and I've never worked on in the e-commerce space before, so that's been kind of fun.
very cool. I'm happy to hear it. Well, Margaret, really excited to chat. We have a great skill to discuss today, and that is researching as a technical writer. I'm excited about this one. This is one we haven't hit yet on the Not Boring Tech Writers, so really excited to hear what insights you have to share with us today. I'm curious, thinking back on your tech writing career, what have you observed throughout your tech writing career that inspired you to pick this skill for this episode?
I think one of the things I've observed is a lot of times writers do research and kind of get to know a subject in depth, and you're able to add things to the product development process because within terminology and hey, did you know that our competitors were doing this thing, and just providing context. And I think I think writers can add a lot of that context because we are sort of looking at things from sort of a excavating the whys and trying to organize information and before we do the processes, write down the
Yeah.
instructions. And so I think that's what I've observed, that having that research background is helpful, and also being able to help users understand what they're doing, not just how to do it, so that when they run into
Hmm.
problems and troubleshooting, they actually can make some progress because they understand what they're doing, as opposed to I'm following these 10 steps and step 5 doesn't work.
Yeah. It'd be nice to have an end goal in mind too, as opposed to just, the sequential list of steps, like what I'm actually trying to
Yeah,
accomplish
yeah, exactly.
throughout this.
Yeah, and I feel like research kind of gives you that. It's really about context.
Yeah, yeah. I love that, Margaret. Thinking back on your tech writing career, did you find that you were a natural researcher, or is it something that you really had to, be mindful of to ensure that you're always keeping, the end user's goal in mind and thinking about their own journey through the documentation, or did this come pretty naturally to you?
The researching part comes really naturally. One of the things that research can also be a bit of a rabbit hole because you can kind of go off and do lots of research.
Hmm.
And so I think the actual research, because I'm curious and I also want to understand, I've gone through, I worked in a lot of different domains in my career. And the
Yeah.
first thing that you have to do is figure out what the terminology, the concepts, the major players in each field, so you have that domain expertise. So that's all come
Hmm.
naturally to me, and then trying to understand why we're doing stuff and then provide that to the user. I think one of the things that I've had to learn and that's shifted a little bit is as our apps have become more basically more for the general public as opposed to people sitting in the back office.
Yeah.
I think just that you have to find ways to incorporate that meaning without getting into a lot of detail, and that's where I struggle. As I'm a natural researcher, but I'm also interested in sort of the nuances and complexities of things. And
Yeah. Yeah.
our users are not always interested in that; they just want to get it. So
Maybe you reserve it for an ebook later
yeah,
on.
right. They want the Cliff's Notes
Um,
version.
yeah. Margaret, give us a few examples of some research you've done. Whenever I think about researching as a writer, specifically as a tech writer, I'm so quick to think, okay, this is just reserved for, interviewing that subject matter expert to ensure I know how the feature works before it rolls out in the next release. But
Mhm.
from how you've just presented it, sounds like for the tech writer, researching goes well beyond just preparing solid questions for the subject matter expert. Looking back in your career, can you think of a few other examples of where your research has been an essential skill to have?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that can happen is those interviews with the subject matter experts. Sometimes there isn't a subject matter expert, or
Oh,
the
yeah,
subject matter expert is not accessible.
yeah,
And the other thing that I found is if you sort of do some of this research and become at least understand the context of the domain that you're working in, it kind of makes your interactions with the subject matter expert go a little further because they see you put
hmm,
in that kind of legwork in. But I actually think some of the other ways where I've used research myself is once I kind of understand things from like the listening perspective, is diving in on some things that are more challenging. Like things like terminology. Sometimes that can be really hard when you're trying to name a complicated feature, and just going and
yeah,
doing research on, hey, what are other people calling this? And honestly, sometimes if it's really complicated, like in the security industry, I worked a lot in identity management when I worked at IBM. Going back and looking at research papers and seeing, what their titles are and what their main subjects are, and that's kind of helped me untangle some of the more complex areas that I've had to document. Just because one of the reasons it's confusing is because people tend to take these complexities, and by the time it turns into software, they've condensed a whole lot of stuff into
yeah,
a field name, and if the workflow's not right, or you know what I mean. There's things that are awkward about it. It's hard to fix it if you don't have that context.
And this reminds me of, it might have been episode 3. We had Bree Hilmer talking about just-in-time documentation.
Yes.
And that conversation was really interesting because, like you said, Margaret, with terminology, you know, uh, the developer has a name for this product
Yeah.
or the action that it
Yeah.
does or what
Yeah.
the field name is. And
Yeah.
likely, since maybe they're documenting all this before the release, the tech writer
Right.
follows suit, uses all that same terminology.
Right.
But then what Bree did with just-in-time documentation, once you create this feedback loop, you discover, oh, like my users are using a completely different term
Right.
for what this product
Exactly.
does. Like
Yeah.
no wonder they're struggling to complete this particular action. They're using a
Oh yeah.
completely
Yeah.
different search term.
Well, and the other thing you'll find is there's this informal, we all do this when we talk to people we're familiar with that we talk to all the time. We use these shorthands
Yeah,
terms and we use things that are not exactly technically correct.
yeah,
And that gets into the documentation. And sometimes you're calling things completely the wrong thing, and that gets propagated through the organization. And then the customers come in and they're the ones that sort of alert us to that confusion sometimes.
yeah.
Sometimes the confusion starts among ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like researching can kind of help. Just being, I think research is a way to kind of inform being kind of precise and exact about the way you're using terms and explaining concepts.
Yeah, I totally agree, Margaret. I want to give you a scenario. So say you need to document new features for an upcoming release. This was something at my first tech
Mm-hmm.
writing gig, something I did a lot. And admittedly, and you might shake your head at me for this, Margaret, the extent of my research was, you know, um, developers would give us, I forget what they call it, like a testing field to
Mm-hmm.
test the new UI.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would just like go through it. And if things like made sense and seemed to work, I would document it. If I had issues, I would go back to the developer and ask him or her if that's how this was supposed to work. In retrospect, was there a different approach I should have had to researching these new features to make sure that they were correct and ready to document? I almost think that I should have just gotten started way earlier and maybe
Yeah,
built some rapport with
I
the
would.
developer earlier on before waiting for just this new UI to mess with.
Yeah, well, actually, sometimes that's kind of how it happens, but a lot of times, and I think things have really changed with Agile. I actually go look for like user stories because
Hmm.
if you have like user driven development where you have a product manager, the customers are asking for features. So I will go and look and try to figure out exactly what the feature, who's asking for this feature, why are they creating it, and sometimes you'll have user stories that will tell you that, um, or you go and look at the Jira. I spend a lot of time looking at tickets, and
Mm,
um, you know because sometimes something's developed. And this
that's
is stuff that you
interesting.
can do before the UI is developed.
Yeah.
Is if developers are working on this stuff, what are they using for their sources to come up with their ideas? And so, kind of looking at some of those same sources. But sometimes you start out with you don't even hear about it until you see the evidence of the UI feature
Uh-huh.
that happens actually a lot. But then I'll go and I will backtrack to the Jira tickets and whatever sources and development processes that the artifacts of that development can be very helpful for researching. Because again, sometimes there's things that are just like an error, like a simple mistake on the part of the developer, and then there's other ones that are
Yeah.
more than a mistake. And sometimes it's hard to know, is this just a simple mistake, or is this a sign of something that requires a little bit more depth? And going back and looking at those sort of primary artifacts helps me
Gotcha.
discern that.
Have you noticed that, embracing the nuance and complexity of different kinds of features and products has helped give you like a mutual respect from different kinds of developers? I've spoke with many tech writers on this podcast where they want to get into developer documentation, but perhaps they don't have that shared language. They never worked with a developer. Have you
Right.
noticed that taking these extra steps and understanding the domain and taking time to look at tickets and understand user stories has helped build that essential respect?
Oh yeah, no, definitely, definitely. I mean, and I remember growing up, and this doesn't happen as much as it used to, but I remember like saying, "How do you, asking, how do you spell this?" And it's like look it up in the dictionary, which is of course you go to Google. But I think it shows some respect to the people you're working with if you try to understand sort of their domain rather than just coming in and expecting someone to sort of spoon feed everything to you. And
Yeah.
that's a little bit of a fine line. I think I err on the side of trying to do too much research and trying to understand too much myself,
Mm,
whereas sometimes I need to, understand sort of just enough before I could go talk to the subject matter expert or developer, and then ask for them for their help. And I think since we've all started using, well, not everybody, but we're using the open source documentation technique where you are doing stuff in GitHub and people are reviewing your PRs and everything happens out in the open.
mm,
I think the cool thing about that is you can actually get a lot more speed because you're not figuring out every little thing by yourself, and somebody will jump in and like say like even writing things. It's like you've spent all this time writing something, and I used to spend a lot of time making it perfect because I didn't have an editor and nobody else had time to look at it.
yeah.
But now I've got other writers reviewing it, and I can make it pretty decent. Another writer can come in and edit it really quickly. Whereas if I tried to make it that perfect, it would have taken me quite a bit longer. So kind of balancing that, knowing enough myself that I can go in with some knowledge, but then knowing when to ask for help and use the knowledge of other people to kind of speed up the process.
Is this a common shift that we're seeing in technical writing, that folk are moving their documentation to GitHub? I wasn't familiar with that.
Yeah, I think so. I think it depends on the domain. I think it works really well in like developer type product, developer documentation,
Yeah.
um, because you just have all these different people contributing. I don't know that it also requires you to have like this a tool chain that has to be maintained, and I think in some contexts it's probably not the best workflow. I think it's a great workflow if you're working in a development technical environment. If you're writing more business documentation, things like that, I'm not so sure.
Gotcha.
That's the best. I think what's good about the GitHub process is it puts you all in the same context. If I'm working
Hmm.
on developer documentations and the developers are developing in GitHub and we're all in the same place, then it just helps us like work together more efficiently.
Yeah,
But one of the
absolutely.
challenges we have is the business users aren't using that workflow, so they're not as it's harder to get them engaged in GitHub because it's totally outside the context of the processes and tools that they're using on a regular basis.
Oh, that makes sense, Margaret. In retrospect, with my first tech writing gig, I wish that we were in an environment where we were working more in GitHub. Really, the only time that I spent in there was the week or two before release to see if there are any new features that needed updates.
Yeah,
Because golly, the first time I'd go in there, I'd be like, "Goodness, what is this place?"
yeah,
Because I was just doing end user documentation, working in just a simple authoring tool. But
yeah.
great skill to have, especially as a tech writer.
Yeah, and also with Git, like going shifting back a little bit to research, is what I think is really cool is if I'm doing documentation, I can use GitHub to like look for stuff in the source code.
Oh,
Like if there's a field
yeah,
name and it has, oh, the person didn't give me the default value or I don't know what type it is, I can just go look it up.
yeah,
And I think that's where this it's I don't know if democratizing is the right word, but when you put everything in one together, like in Google, and everyone can search it, or in GitHub, then you still have subject matter experts, but there's an awful lot of stuff that you can find yourself just through research.
yeah,
um, which then again you have to balance that. It's like, yeah, I could find this myself, but it's going to take me X amount of time, or I could just ask this developer for the answer and they could just tell me.
sure.
And
That totally makes sense.
it depends on your relationship, I think, with the people that you're working with. Which,
Yeah. Well, it kind of helps you to make your own like informed conclusions.
yes,
Like as you find that first initial like rabbit hole for your research,
right,
maybe you discover what you're looking for, but then all the context that surrounds it
Right.
Because tech writers are like
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
They come to good conclusions about the kind of things that they need to document and the user's story and how it fits with it.
Hmm.
That's wonderful, Margaret.
Hmm.
To wrap up, I'm curious. We have a lot of tech writers who listen to this podcast that work in end user documentation.
Hmm.
So imagine whenever they think about research, they really want to know, they want to be able to ensure that what they're documenting aligns with how the user is actually wanting to use their product. We
Hmm.
talked about just-in-time documentation. And again, listeners,
Hmm.
I'll include it in the show notes. Really encourage y'all to check out that episode. Have
Hmm.
you noticed any other research strategies that helped you discover or just at least give you some context to learn how users are using your product?
Well, we've been using at my current job, we've been using a product called Hotjar, which it's actually got a feedback mechanism, but you can also like create heat maps. And my one of my colleagues recently, there's a feature you can activate where you can record the user's path through a document, or through their session. And I
Nice.
think that's super valuable way to find out how people are actually using your documentation.
Yeah.
And of course, Google Analytics. And I think one of the things that happens is you get very caught up in actually getting the work done, and you have all these data collecting mechanisms that are available, but you don't necessarily have time to go look at them. And I'd say it's well worth looking at them. Um, and then also, looking at user like forums, and
Mm.
just going to Google, and I just searching for your product name in whatever particular field. And sometimes you find out, oh gee, like this error that I'm trying to document is the top 10 lists on Google. Like when I
Wow.
search for it,
Yeah.
everybody's having this problem and someone else has already documented it. Probably we should have it in our documentation too. And it's a good way to find things with your, if you're working on a product and if users are having problems. Even Twitter, I use Twitter for research all the time.
Interesting. Seeing what people are tweeting about?
Well, if you have a product, you just search for your
Yeah.
product name, and if
Yeah.
introduce a new feature is introduced, you can kind of find out sometimes through the back door, like what are the other people in your company tweeting about your product, and find out really interesting information that way.
Yeah.
And users, of course, now I don't work for like Delta Airlines or United or whatever, but sometimes users will call out your product specifically.
Yes. Well familiar with
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So,
So, Margaret, thinking back on your tech writing career and all the great research you've done, have you made any discoveries that like you never thought you would have discovered about a particular product that you were documenting?
I think one of the things that has been a little bit different for me working with Magento that I currently work at. I think it's the first place that I've ever worked where I would go do like, because Magento is an open source product, and it's used
Hmm.
by all these different system integrators, and there's lots of companies who serve customers and large communities, and they actually have their own documentation. And so when you go search for stuff, our documentation doesn't come up first.
Oh, wow.
That was actually kind of a huge.
Interesting.
I think that was one of the most interesting things that I'm adapting to now. And what's interesting to me about that is sometimes when I'm writing documentation, I'm actually learning from our the people that are using our product, the ecosystem, the
Yeah.
Magento ecosystem. Um,
Yeah.
and as I said, sometimes people have already written about what you're struggling with in your company, because they're writing about it from, hey, I have this customer. This customer has this problem. We need to solve the problem. Whereas you're on the development side, and maybe they're trying to make it so the customer doesn't have to have that problem. And
Yeah.
meeting those 2 points is where you can get some real value to add to the documentation, I think.
That's so interesting, Margaret. And I imagine it helps inform you about where these help resources should exist. Like in the example you just gave, maybe it's like, hey, like maybe we should consider creating like Magento like help blog because that's like the kind of format where people are trying to find help.
Yeah,
That's so
yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, there's just so much information available, which is another reason why I think research is really important
Yeah,
because, and also, knowing how to filter and, how to find out if you're getting, first sources and things like that. But I think sifting through all this information is becoming a really key skill.
yeah. And tech writer, if you're listening to this and feeling a bit overwhelmed by perhaps all the complexity and nuance of research, I imagine that within all of you, this is a natural skill that just with some time, maybe setting aside and researching the domain in which your product exists and different terminology probably will come pretty easy to folk. Would you agree, Margaret? This is a natural skill that many of us have.
Yeah, I think it. I actually laugh because your podcast is the not so boring tech writer. To me, I think the research and all these different concepts is what makes technical writing, which from the outside might look boring, but it's sort of very much very interesting because there's
It
all these
is.
different types of information and technologies and ideas and new ways of doing things, and that's all driven by everybody's research, right? We're all
Yeah,
trying to figure out ways to do things.
that's right.
So it's to
Well,
me, it's what makes writing not boring.
yeah, yeah, I love it. Well, Margaret, this has been an absolute joy. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me and sharing your expertise as a researcher. If anyone wants to connect with you online, learn more about the great work that you're doing, where can people find you online?
LinkedIn is the best place.
Perfect. And listeners, I'll make sure to include that in the show notes so you can connect with Margaret. Margaret, thank you. This has been fun. Hope you have an enjoyable Monday, and we will chat very soon.
All right. Thanks, Jacob. Have a
Thanks,
good
Margaret.
one. Bye bye.
Thanks again to Knowledge Owl, creators of the wonderful knowledge-based software, for sponsoring the Not Boring Tech Writer podcast. And thanks so much to each of you for listening to this episode. And if you're looking for a tech writing gig or know someone looking for a tech writing gig, I got a cool opportunity for you. Do you know a tech writer who's passionate about customer service and would be interested in a role in San Francisco? If so, Red Balloons is offering a $2,000 referral bonus. All you need to do is go to redballoons.co/techwriter and refer someone or share your personalized link. Redballoons.co is a new recruiting platform that connects amazing people with great companies and rewards you for helping out. For more information, go to redballoons.co/techwriter. Talk soon.